Chapter 2. By the next morning, there was snow everywhere, but not enough to cancel school. The buses arrived one by one, their wheels slurping through the slush and shooting wet snow along the edge of the sidewalk so that the walkers, the children who lived near the school, had to jump aside. Gooney Bird Green entered the classroom with the other children, and they began to remove hats and mittens and jackets and boots. They all kept indoor footwear in their cubbies. One by one, they lined up their wet boots and changed into their dry slippers and clogs and Crocs. "What on earth are those, Gooney Bird?" Mrs. Pigeon asked, watching as Gooney Bird sat on the floor and tried to wrestle something off her feet. Gooney Bird scowled. "Well," she said, "I thought they were high-fashion boots. I got them at the Goodwill store on the half-price table. $1.45. "Quite a bargain," Mrs. Pigeon commented, still looking at Gooney Bird's feet. "Need some help?" "Thank you." Gooney Bird hobbled to a nearby bench, sat down, and held her legs out. One at a time, Mrs. Pigeon pulled off the wet boots. They were bright blue, with very high, thin heels. When Mrs. Pigeon had set them side by side on the shelf, next to the long puddled row of ordinary rubber boots, Gooney Bird looked at them with distaste. "I thought the stiletto heels were very cool," she said. "Stiletto means a thin, pointy stabbing tool, and that's why they call these stiletto heels, see?" She held one up. "But they're not comfortable. They do stab, and they were slippery on the ice. I fell twice on my way to school. Look, my knees are all wet." Mrs. Pigeon felt the damp knees of Gooney Bird's black tights sympathetically. "Goodness," she said. "I have buyer's remorse," Gooney Bird said. "What's that?" asked Felicia Ann, who was nearby watching. "It's when you wish you hadn't bought something," Gooney Bird explained. "I hardly ever have it. I make my purchases carefully. But today I have a bad case of buyer's remorse about those dumb boots." She looked at them with a frown and slid her feet into the soft bunny slippers she kept in her cubby. "My dad has buyer's remorse about our car," Ben said. "It always needs repairs and it's noisy." He drove an imaginary car across his desk and made a roaring sound. "My mom has buyer's remorse about a bottle of milk she bought at the corner store," Malcolm said. "It was too old, and when she opened it, she made a face at the smell. It smelled like barf." Mrs. Pigeon held up her hand to ask for quiet, because it was clear that all of the second graders were going to start making barfing noises. She went to the front of the room and picked up a folder from her desk. She took a paper out of the folder and looked at it with a smile. "Today's poem," she announced. "See if you can guess why I chose it." She began to read, but was interrupted after the first two words. "Please excuse me for interrupting, Mrs. Pigeon," Keiko said with her hand up. "But you must always start by saying the title and the author's name. You taught us that." Tyrone used to say Arthur instead of author, Malcolm, chortling, reminded everyone. Remember when Tyrone thought it was Arthur? All poems were written by Arthur? Is Tyrone dumb or what? Mrs. Pigeon, still holding the paper, went to Malcolm's desk and put her calm down hand on his shoulder. Actually, there are many poets named Arthur, so it may be that Tyrone was smarter about poetry than most of us. And we all certainly know what a good poet Tyrone is when he creates his raps. Got one now, Tyrone? Tyrone, whose face had turned very glum, brightened up. He snapped his fingers and thought for a minute. Soon as I get home, gonna write me a poem, he chanted. Good. Maybe we all will. Maybe that could be our homework tonight, Mrs. Pigeon said. And you're right, Keiko. It is correct to read the title and the author's name, which in many cases could, in fact, be Arthur. She glanced at Malcolm. But for the moment, I'm simply going to read the poem, and then I'm going to explain the title and tell you the author. Okay? Ready? Shall I begin? All of the children nodded. In a quiet, clear voice, Mrs. Pigeon read, Over the pavement, snow falls in January, soap flakes wash our tracks. It's another little poem, Felicia Ann pointed out. It doesn't rhyme, Barry Tuckerman said. All of our snow day poems rhymed. It is nice, though, Tricia said. It makes a picture in my head. Poems don't have to rhyme, Beanie reminded them. I see London, I see France. That rhymes, Ben called out. France rhymes with... He stopped, aware that Mrs. Pigeon was glaring at him. Sorry, he said. Cheap laugh. Oh, Mrs. Pigeon, Mrs. Pigeon. Keiko churned her arm in the air. It was quite unlike Keiko to be so excited. Her face was pink with enthusiasm. What is it, Keiko? Keiko stood beside her desk. It's haiku, isn't it? She said, grinning. It's haiku. I recognize it. Haiku is Japanese. Keiko's family was Japanese American. Her grandparents had grown up in Japan, though now they lived with her whole family in the town of Water Tower. She'd gone back with them once to Yokohama for a visit. She had sent a postcard with a picture of Mount Fuji to Mrs. Pigeon. The postcard was still on the bulletin board. That's correct. And in fact, Mrs. Pigeon said, that's the reason I didn't start with the title. The title of this poem is simply haiku. Is it by an Arthur? Said Nicholas. She laughed. No, she said. It's by a Japanese person, stupid, called Malcolm. I bet Daisuke wrote it, right? Said Ben. He's Japanese. Mrs. Pigeon wrinkled her forehead. Who is Daisuke? She asked. All the boys began to laugh. Mrs. Pigeon was not a sports fan, and Daisuke was a famous baseball player. Nicholas explained that to her. Oh, she said. Thank you. I didn't know that. And maybe Daisuke does write poems while he's sitting in what is that place called? The birch bark? The dugout, the boys all yelled. Mrs. Pigeon laughed. I knew that. I was just teasing. But no, this haiku isn't by Daisuke. In fact, it isn't by a Japanese person. The Japanese invented haiku, that's true, but anyone is allowed to use the form. And the author of this haiku is actually our room mother. The children were silent for a moment. But our room mother is your mother, Chelsea said at last. That's true. She's Mrs. X, said Beanie. Mrs. Pigeon laughed. Well, that's what we all called her for a while when she was being mysterious and didn't want us to guess who she was. I remember when she came from the nursing home and brought us cupcakes, Tricia said. She's very, very old. That's true, Mrs. Pigeon said. My mother is very, very old, and she's not very well at the moment, so I've been spending a lot of time at the nursing home with her. I opened an old trunk filled with things from her past, and I found all these poems that she had written. I sit by her bed and read them to her. She likes that. Yesterday, when I read this haiku, I decided it would be a good one for our morning poem. Mrs. Pigeon, I have a poem. I just made it up, Malcolm called. The teacher sighed. All right, Malcolm, she said. Malcolm stood. He said in a loud voice, Haiku, Kung Fu. He made his hands into fists, struck a pose, and kicked one leg into the air. When all of the boys began to arrange themselves in martial art poses, Mrs. Pigeon quickly went to the piano and played a few soft chords. It was her best method for calming down the entire class. It always worked. When they were quiet and calm, she said, I'm just going to describe the rules of haiku to you quickly, and then we must go on to our math. She wrote her mother's poem on the board. Over the pavement, snow falls in January. Soap flakes wash our tracks. They all read it together. Okay, said Mrs. Pigeon. 3 lines, 5 syllables in the first line. They read the first line slowly so that they could hear the syllables. 5. Next line, said Mrs. Pigeon. They read the second line and could hear that it was true. 7 syllables. Finally, 5 again in the third line, she told them. And they read it aloud. Usually a haiku is about one of the seasons, she explained. This one, of course, is about winter. It describes snow in January. What other seasons do we have? Summer, said Felicia Ann. Spring. Correct. And fall or autumn. So there we have the basic rules of haiku. Later today, we'll have time to give writing haiku a try. But right now, she looked at the clock, we really must get to our math problems. Then Mrs. Pigeon noticed that Gooney Bird Green, who had been very quiet, had her hand raised. Yes, Gooney Bird? I wrote one, Gooney Bird said. I know I should have been facing forward, hands folded, eyes on you when you were talking, but I couldn't help myself. Sometimes you just can't help yourself. She held up a lined paper with some writing on it. I know, that's true sometimes. All right, Gooney Bird, why don't you read it to the class, then math. Gooney Bird stood, frowning. She adjusted the damp knees of her tights. Then she read from her paper, Haiku by Gooney Bird Green. Winter walk to school, stiletto boots, icy street, toes and knees suffer. So friends, your assignment is going to be to write your own haiku. Remember, 575. Winter walk to school, 5 syllables. Stiletto boots, icy street, 7 syllables. Toes and knees suffer, 5 syllables. Just remember 3 lines, 575. And I can't wait to see some of your haiku.